We are now sitting in public order, and proceedings are being broadcast. Before we start hearing from witnesses, do any members wish to make a declaration of interest in connection with the bill? We will now hear oral evidence from the National Police Chiefs Council, National Crime Agency and Crown Prosecution Service. We have until 2:40 for this panel. Could witnesses please introduce themselves briefly for the record?
Thank you. I'm Roger, Director General Operations from the National Crime Agency.
Good afternoon. My name is Sarah Dineley. I'm Head of International at Crown Prosecution Service, and I'm the National CPS Lead on Organised Immigration Crime.
Good afternoon. I'm Assistant Chief Constable Jim Pearce, and I'm the National Police Chiefs Lead for Organised Immigration Crime.
Thank you very much. I now call Matt Forrester.
Hi, thanks. What do you think is the single biggest thing that the government could be doing to drive down illegal arrivals, and also what could we be doing to aid your agency in doing its job?
So if I come back first on that, there isn't one thing you can do to tackle these problems. You need a range of measures which can currently bear down on the problem. And the problem that I focus on is the organised crime element of that, and that needs concurrent effort in a number of areas, and that is really designed to undermine the business model that supports organised immigration crime. So that's tackling illicit finance, the materials that are used in smuggling attempts, so the supply chain that supports them, the high-value targets that are based overseas, that are involved in supplying materials and moving migrants, and those that are closer in near Europe that are involved in it. So from an organised crime perspective, it's about concurrent pressure in a number of areas to make their incentives for being involved in organised immigration crime no longer viable.
So, thanks Rob. So from my perspective, you need to look at this at both ends of the scale. So what we're probably thinking about at the moment is prosecution and putting people through courts. Actually, what we know is that in other thematics of serious organised crime, prevention and early intervention works just as effectively. So we would call that disruption. So disruption, the patterns and the ways of working that Rob has just described earlier, then would obviously stop victims becoming victims at the end. So it's that 4P approach that I'm sure that most of you have heard of. I'm working from a neighbourhood police in a local factor in order to gather intelligence, put that into the system all the way up through our regional crime units and into the National Crime Agency, into high-end prosecution, international and online.
I concur with my two colleagues. I don't believe there's one single measure that will impact so significantly that it would reduce migrant crossings to zero. But I think it is about having a suite of measures, whether they are prosecutorial or whether they are disruptive in nature, that when taken together will allow both the prosecution and law enforcement teams to work together to tackle the gangs. And I think it's always important to remember that a criminal justice outcome isn't necessarily the right outcome. There are other outcomes which can tackle organised immigration crime, can tackle gangs effectively.
Are there any further specific measures that you'd like to see in the bill to strengthen the hand of your agency?
From a prosecution point of view, I would say that's a matter for the legislators as to what legislation they would feel appropriate. But I think the bill, as drafted, does add additional tools to the current toolkit of measures that we have.
So from my perspective, the measures that are most different and most significant in tackling the organised crime element is the Acts Preparatory, the 13 through to 16, which give us the ability to be preemptive, proactive, and very disruptive. And what that gives is something that we've not had before in being able to act before people are actually committing a Section 25 offence, which is the facilitation offence. And that's an important opportunity because we are driven by trying to reduce these highest risk crossings and trying to prevent crossings. We wouldn't choose to react to crossings and then investigate. We want to act as quickly as we can. And these measures create the ability to do that and go much earlier and have more impact and build momentum so that the people that are behind these attempts really start to feel the pressure.
I think for me, in addition to what's already been said, I believe that the bill is giving opportunity to provide clarity and focus. So, for example, being able to gain information and intelligence, and I know it's controversial, but through the seizure of electronic devices, being able to do that with a very clear power to search, seize, and then download, as opposed to potentially, and I'm not saying this has happened, but potentially misusing existing powers. So this will just give clarity to say, this is what you use to an operational police officer or immigration officer or a member of the National Crime Agency in order to get that defined intelligence at the end.
And what concerns, if any, do you have about the bill as drafted at the moment?
I think if I was to just, from a policing point of view, there would be insurance around safeguarding. So for the electronic devices, for example, I understand the benefits that would come through in terms of the CT style powers, being able to seize electronic devices, but I'm confident that with the measures that are in place around reasonable suspicion and having to get the advice from a senior officer, that that's managed. But it's operationalising that, if that's a word, excuse me, but it's just putting that into practice, making sure that our staff understand through education and training, and of course, not just because of this change in legislation, any change in legislation that then requires training, finance and input. So, they're the types of things that I would be thinking about.
Thank you. Yeah, I would agree with that. It's the professional development, it's the guidance for officers that are using new tactics, new tools against this threat, and making sure that we're ready to go with all of that, with very clear guidance on how officers should look to engage the new offences that are in the Act, in the bill.
From my perspective, obviously Section 17 and one of the subsections of Section 18 create extraterritorial jurisdiction for the offences. And I think it would be remiss not to highlight some of the challenges that will bring. We have a system of judicial cooperation, something called mutual legal assistance, whereby we can obtain intelligence and evidence from our overseas counterparts, both at judicial and law enforcement level. We work very hard on building those relationships to collaborate, and the CPS, to that end, has a network of liaison prosecutors based across the world. And specifically, we do have liaison prosecutors based in the major OIC countries, so in Spain, Italy, Turkey, Germany, Netherlands, Belgium, 2 in France, one of whom is actually a dedicated organised immigration crime liaison prosecutor. And we do use them to foster those relationships, to build so that we can have that reciprocal exchange of information where required. But that's not to say it's without its challenges. So that I flag as something which we will continue to work on, but it has challenges.
Thank you. Thank you, Shadow Minister. Minister.
Thank you very much, Chair. What does the panel think that this bill does for you operationally in your separate issues, starting with Rob Jones?
Thank you, Minister. So it gives us the opportunity to make the most of the intelligence dividend which we've invested in trying to tackle the threat. So we have a good understanding of the people that are behind, particularly small boats crossings, the supply of materials, the facilitation from near Europe and further afield. But what we want is greater momentum and greater agility, so that when we're aware that a crossing is being prepared, when materials are moving, we can act preemptively and proactively. As I said earlier, we don't want to be investigating after thousands of people have been arrived and trying to put together very complex investigations which may involve months of covert surveillance, eavesdropping, a whole range of covert tactics to get us over the line for a charging decision for a Section 25 offence. The new offences give us the opportunity to act when we start to see that jigsaw puzzle coming together, and when we reach a tipping point, go to CPS and go earlier than we can do now. That means we can pull more people through that system. It means we can deliver justice more quickly, and we can be more disruptive in terms of tackling the threat. And that's a big step forward. That was lacking with the current toolbox that we had to operationalise the intelligence that we had.
Any other comments on that before I ask another question?
I think potentially the endangerment offence fills a gap between the current Section 24 and Section 25 legislation, because clearly each boat has a pilot, someone who is steering that boat across the channel, and they, by the very nature and condition of those boats and the overcrowding, lack of life-saving equipment, etc., put everyone in that boat in danger of losing their life. So we welcome that clause, and we'll be drafting guidance around how that can be interpreted in terms of practical application.
Jim?
Thank you. So, police officers will mainly deal with the inland clandestine events as opposed to the small boats. So from my point of view, it would be correctly common practice to use Schedule 2, paragraph 17 of the Immigration Act in order to detain migrants and then pass them into the immigration system. Searches after that, yes, there are powers through PACE under the after that provision under Section 32, but that's mainly to safeguard. It's not to seize evidence. So I'll tell you that to start with, because then I go back to Rob's point, which is about that early intervention and intelligence gathering. And the only way that you gather intelligence particularly is through what people tell you and what electronic devices give up. And so what this does, this allows the police officers the ability to gather that intelligence through defined and very clear powers through legislation, so they're not misusing a PACE power or other aspects in terms of operational procedures or otherwise. So that would be the biggest change, I think, for policing.
We hear often that this organised immigration crime is very lucrative, very well established, transnational, and therefore there's no point in doing a lot about it. What would be your answer to that?
I'll answer that first. I mean, you can say that around all serious organised crime, and that's quite... where'd you go from there? So I don't agree with that view. It's definitely transnational, it's definitely complicated, but this is a relatively new serious organised crime threat, and it's not too late to stop it. In 2018, there were a few hundred people coming on small boats. There were 36,000 last year. You know, so we need to unravel the conditions that have allowed that to happen, and this legislation helps with it. So I don't take the view you can't stop it. You know, organised immigration crime, there will always be people attempting it, but this particular element of it in relation to small boats is relatively new, and there are very specific things that organised crime groups involved in it need to do. They need access to very specific materials, otherwise they can't move the numbers that they attempt to move, and they need to be able to operate using materials which are lawfully obtained but for criminal purposes. Now, this attacks that business model because the dual-use materials that these people are using, we can pursue with more vigour and have more impact on them. So it is challenging. It's a different challenge to drugs. It's a different challenge to other threats. But it is there to be dealt with. It's a very public manifestation of the OIC threat that's always been there. But this part of it relies on a very specific business model which we can attack.
And I think the follow-on point from that is one which you raised, which is people are making a lot of money out of this. And so the illicit finance piece is really important. And I think that these new clauses actually give us more upon which to hang those illicit finance investigations. And there's a lot of work going on in the illicit finance sphere, particularly most recently the illicit finance task force that's been set up between the UK and Italy, specifically to look at the profits which are being made by the people who are preying on people's misery.
And further to that, it's been said already, but I'll reinforce the point around organised crime gangs being involved in polycriminality. So organised immigration crime is part, but so is modern slavery, serious acquisitive crime, clearly drug running, etc. And that's felt in our local communities across the whole country. So in my own force, which is Devon and Cornwall, you would think that modern slavery, organised immigration crime doesn't exist, but we've got a number of investigations and intelligence leads that are being developed and are being looked after actually by our regional crime units and also members of Rob's team. So it exists everywhere across the country. And as I say, if you're prepared to effectively smuggle people into the country, or at least facilitate that, then you are very prepared to get involved in very serious things indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Will Forrester.
Thank you, Chair. I want to turn to clauses 13 to 17, if I may, so it's a bit more directed at you, Sarah, about what the CPS will think of these, particularly the inside or outside of the UK side of things. What do you think the chances of successful prosecution are? How likely do you think the CPS would take this? And then moving to 13 to 16, we heard earlier today that there's just concern from others about how wide these powers could be. I'm at Calais, someone asked me, what's the weather like today? Someone has told us today that, well, technically you could have committed a crime under these clauses. What's your view of that?
So if I deal with the second point first, that's probably the easiest and then flows into the first. So in relation to 13 to 16, with any new legislation, the Crown Prosecution Service always publishes guidance as to how it is to be interpreted. And certainly the example that you gave about what's the weather like in Dover, if I'm stood in Calais, wouldn't fall within the guidance as meeting the evidential test for that. But of course, it's not just about an evidential test being met, it's also about a public interest test being met. And our guidance always deals with that specific question of, is it in the public interest? So that prosecutors can make that balancing exercise as to, are there factors which weigh in favour of prosecution? Are there factors which tend away from prosecution? So that we come to a decision which is compliant with our code for Crown prosecutors. So it's a mixture of guidance and it's a mixture of application of the code, which hopefully gets us to the right conclusion. Going back to the first point, I've mentioned already about how we have mutual legal assistance and how we are able to issue what are called international letters of request, which require the recipient country to execute them, so to provide the information that we have asked for. One of the problems is that there has to be something called dual criminality. So there has to be the equivalent offence in the country we are making the request to. There are some gaps across Europe in establishing dual criminality for all of the immigration offences that we currently have out on our books. But we are confident that there are reciprocal laws in the major OIC countries in Europe to allow us to make those requests for information under mutual legal assistance. And we're aided, of course, by that network of prosecutors that I've mentioned that we've got based abroad. We also have the assistance of Eurojust and what we call JIPs, the Joint Investigation Teams running out of Eurojust. So we are well versed in working internationally and the measures that we can employ or deploy to make sure that we can build a strong evidential case.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Mike Tapp.
Thank you, Chair. And I should declare, as earlier, that I have worked for the National Crime Agency and in a counter-terror role. We've talked a lot about the upstream side of this, which I think publicly people are well aware of. The question I have is there a significant domestic angle here? Are we confident that we've got a sound intelligence picture as much as we can be? Are there crossovers with other crime? And does this bill help us disrupt and arrest people in this country? Thank you.
if I come back on that first, so there is a footprint in the UK for organised immigration crime. The footprint in relation to the small boats crossings has typically been driven by Belgium, Germany, Turkey and further afield in Iraqi Kurdish groups and Afghan groups. But as more and more people have successfully exploited that route, they put down ties, they get involved in criminality, they know it's worked for them, so that starts to drive the problem. So there are organised crime groups in the UK that we are targeting. Some of the most significant cases we've done to date have involved a footprint in the UK. And when we've looked at those groups and what it took to bring them to justice, we've either had to extradite them to another country following a judicialised investigation, or we've done very complex covert investigations for many, many months. This helps with that issue because when we've got very good evidence from covert tactics, it's my earlier point about being able to go earlier with it. But the majority of the criminality that drives this, the small boats element, is based overseas. We have got a good intelligence picture on OIC, which has improved dramatically since 2015 when we started really targeting this when the crisis first started.
A follow-on from policing, probably 2 points for me to make. The first is tomorrow you will start hearing national media around interventions across the country, which is termed op-mill. This is interventions that police have been doing around cannabis farms. A lot of the intelligence that's linked to that particular operation involves workers that have been brought in illegally and abroad, and all of those disruptions will be from across the whole country. So that's just to perhaps bring it to life. The second point I just wanted to say, because you just asked about legislation changes, and I think the two changes, well, there's more than two, but the changes particularly that I wanted to focus on are two relating to the serious crime prevention orders and the ability for both law enforcement, police, NCA and the CPS, of course, to be able to apply for interim orders and especially those on acquittal. And I think that serious crime prevention orders are probably a tool, Rob, that is underused at the moment. And you know, we would be very keen to start to push into that space moving forward.
Just to put that into context, at the moment there are effectively two types of serious crime prevention order. One which is imposed on conviction. Between 2011 and 2022 we had 1,057. There are then what we call the standalone serious crime prevention orders, which are made before any charges are brought, which are heard in the High Court. And to date, there have only been 2 applications, one of which was successful. So the introduction of this new serious crime prevention order really does fill an absolutely massive gap in that restrictive order.
Thank you.
I agree with that. Welcome those new measures. There is a similar regime for sexual offences which allows control measures for people that are suspected of offences, and that has been very successful. So we welcome that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Pete Wishart.
I could sense your enthusiasm for the new criminal clauses which are included in the bill. To a certain degree, I get it, but it's got to keep you busy, isn't it? Gosh, there are going to be lots of asylum seekers caught up in the various clauses from 13 to 18. Now, I'm just wondering what proportion from ordinary asylum seekers to members of gangs and people who operate this business you're going to have. And I'm struck by your confidence, Mr. Jones, that you're going to end this. I mean, like, and I think it was a comparison that you made with illegal drugs. Well, you're probably right to raise that comparison. They're both demand-led and they're both operated by illegal gangs. We've not been particularly successful with illegal drugs over the course of the past decades. And just lastly, to Ms Dineley, I saw you said something about pilots of these boats. Well, I hope your intelligence is telling you exactly the people who are piloting these boats. It's not the gang members or people associated with this crime. It's ordinary asylum seekers who can't afford the fare or are compelled and forced into piloting these boats. So I just hope when we're approaching some of these new powers and clauses you're going to get, you will be proportionate, you will know what's going on, and you're not going to be endlessly prosecuting innocent people who are just asylum seekers fleeing oppression and warfare.
Would you like me to answer your first question and then perhaps CPS can come in? So we are not looking to pursue asylum seekers who aren't involved in serious and organised crime. That's not what we do. That's not what we do. This is about tackling serious and organised crime and being as effective as we can be in doing that. So there are examples of people that are involved in piloting boats who are connected to the organised crime groups. There are examples of some of the events that we've seen.
Supply the committee with evidence of that, yes? Would you be able to supply the committee with evidence that people who were
people have been convicted for offences, for those offences. So, you know, that has passed an evidential test. So moving on to our role in this is about undermining a specific element of the business model. It isn't like drugs trafficking. Drugs trafficking has been established since the Misuse of Drugs Act in the 1970s. It is a lot older, it's a lot more established, it involves billions of pounds and tens of thousands, if not more, of people internationally. The small boats threat is different to that. It's the highest harm manifestation of organised immigration crime. I haven't said I'll stop organised immigration crime. I have said that we will tackle the small boats business model and then we will continue to tackle the OIC threat, as we've been doing since 2015.
So in relation to asylum seekers piloting boats, under the Immigration Act, obviously we've got two offences, Section 24 and Section 25. Section 25 being the facilitation offence. And our guidance is very clear on when we charge the Section 25 facilitation offence. And it's very clear from our guidance that it's not just about having a hand on the tiller, it's about being part of a management chain, being part of the organisation of that crossing. You mentioned people who are coerced into taking the tiller, and we would look under Section 24, so arriving illegally, as to whether an offence of duress would be sustained. And that would form part of our considerations as to whether evidentially it's made out, and secondly, whether it's in the public interest to prosecute that person. So we do look at the whole set of circumstances, and our guidance sets out in very clear terms what is required, both the evidential tests and what is required in terms of the public interest tests, that balancing exercise. We also have specific guidance in relation to how we treat refugees and asylum seekers, and that again plays into that charging decision equation, as I'll put it, the balancing exercise.
I'm not sure I've got a lot to add to my colleagues.
Maybe you could help us, just what would be the proportion of asylum seekers to gang members do you think you'll secure with the new Persian?
Well, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to answer that question, but what I can tell you is that policing since November 23 for 12 months were involved with 2,000, just under 2,000 inland clandestine incidents. So what I mean by that are relevant persons that have been found in the back of an HUV, walk into police stations declaring asylum, those that have been left at petrol stations, for example, and then picked up by police patrols and brought in. So that's 2,000 incidents and nearly 3,000 persons. Now, obviously, they're not all being arrested for organised immigration crime offences because they haven't necessarily committed them. And my colleague on the here has spoken about the aggravating factors that sit within Section 24, which is the key points to prove. So, as I say, that's probably what I could offer you at this moment in time.
And perhaps if I just put things into sort of some numerical context, last year we had 37,000 arrivals in the UK through small boats crossings alone. In the period from April to September last year, there were only 250 prosecutions.
And were they gang members then? Yes.
I can't break that down, but that would include gang members. That's the total number of prosecutions.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Kenny Stevenson.
Thank you, Chair. This question might be a lag question, which is quite engineering based, but you mentioned proactive, preemptive and disruptive, and those are engineering terms as well. But what I would really be interested in is how they react and would work within the bill and how they would help the bill, and the bill would help them as well. If you could give us some idea of that.
So where we have, in relation to the 13 to 16 powers?
Yes. If you could give us, I apologise because I think I've cut across the Minister because she asked a very similar question. But if you could give us an idea of how these three things that you spoke about before could be helped by the bill, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, thank you. So when we identify somebody that's involved in organising small boats crossings from the UK, for instance, we have to get very good, sophisticated surveillance control over that individual to get enough evidence to be able to produce a full file submission to the CPS for Section 25 facilitation offence. So that could be months of surveillance, it could be covert activity in terms of eavesdropping and audio recordings. Meantime, we are seeing that individual with a public profile on social media, researching crossings, communicating with people overtly, meeting people. And when you're looking at the commissioning of the offence and you are living with somebody that is involved in serious organised crime, you're seeing that play out in front of you. What these sections do is allow us to take elements of their business model as they're meeting people, as they're researching, as they are taking the preparatory steps to the Section 25 offence to go to CPS and say, we think we've got enough, we think we could go now. And that gives you more momentum, more speed, more agility, and it's the same mindset that tries to prevent attacks in the CT world. You wouldn't choose to reactively investigate a terrorist attack. We would not choose to reactively investigate highly dangerous crossings during which people get killed in the English Channel. We would choose to preemptively stop that. And that's what the new offences would introduce.
Thank you.
Thank you. Tom Hayes.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for what they said today for their service. My question is around the asylum decisions backlog. So the country faces an asylum decisions backlog and we are now starting to move through that. The consequence is that, of course, some people will have their grants rejected, others will have them accepted. Where the grants are accepted, what would you say to anybody who claims that that could be a pull factor for people to try and access this country? And then just picking up on the point that you said, Mr. Jones, about criminal gangs starting to feel the pressure with this new suite of tools, would you say that the tools provided for in this bill, which will have a disruptive effect, could in consequence also have a deterrent effect on criminal smuggler gangs?
So if I take this second question first, so obviously time will tell, but adding to what we are doing already, it will rack up the pressure. And that starts to change behaviour, increases cost, and it increases friction in the business model. Those things contribute to deterring people from getting involved, and we see that with other areas of criminality. I will allow others to answer the asylum question.
I'm going to dip out rather and say it's not really a matter for the Crown Prosecution Service. But what I can tell you is that the Home Office are undertaking a piece of work looking at what the pull factors are for migrants wanting to reach the UK and at what point they reach the firm decision that the UK is their final destination.
If I reframe the question then, have you seen any evidence to suggest that it may be a pull factor?
There is nothing I have read in any interview provided by a migrant to suggest that that is a pull factor.
I'm not sure. I mean, I have a personal view, but I'm speaking on behalf of the National Police Chiefs, and I'm not sure I'm in a position to do that. I feel that that's probably a question to either Immigration Enforcement or the Home Office.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Chris Murray.
Thank you for your really interesting testimonies that you brought today. We really appreciate it. Two questions from me. So we heard from the Migration Observatory before you that one of the challenges in this world is that demand is essentially inelastic. They could double the price of the crossings and there's still going to be a market of people who would pay it, even for very flimsy boats. And it sort of strikes me, sort of picking up on Tom's question there, the Rwanda scheme, which this legislation repeals, was very much focused on deterrence, ostensibly, and therefore trying to tackle the demand. And because demand was inelastic, it was not having the effect. Sounds to me like what you're saying is this legislation is focusing on the supply and just making it impossible for people to cross the channel, no matter how much demand there is for it. Is that right? I mean, have I understood that correctly? And then my second question is more one for you, Sarah, and I should probably declare an interest again, because I was the Home Affairs Attaché at the Embassy in Paris previously, and you talked about the international cooperation. You mentioned things like the JITs and stuff like that, and Eurojust, and you referenced the challenges that we face there. Now, I wanted to ask a bit about, and we'd also heard previously from a previous contributor, the UK no longer being in Dublin is actually being cited by migrants as one of the reasons that they are going in. So I wanted to ask you, Sarah, post-Brexit, what are those challenges the UK is facing? Can you say more about that? How do we build relations with key allies to overcome them?
I'll start with how we build the key allies. So I've talked about our network of liaison prosecutors. We regularly engage and hold engagement events with our overseas prosecutors. So this year alone, we have had engagement events in Ireland, Spain, and 2 weeks ago in Italy. And that is around building those relationships, finding out what their challenges are, finding out about their legal system, and what barriers there are to the cooperation that we're seeking. Because I think we do have to recognise that different countries have a different legal framework, and we can't simply impose our framework on another country. So we have to be able to work around their framework to try and get what we need from them.
Sorry, thank you. I just quickly want to get Mike Tapp's question in, and you might just so you can summarise. We've just got 2 minutes left, Mike.
I'll make it quick, thank you. I'm really pleased to see the enthusiasm for this disruptive approach, by the way. In terms of the Border Security Command, how do you see that working both strategically and operationally?
So for me, I've worked really, really closely with Martin Hewitt already. It works well. It allows me to focus on the operational leadership of tackling the organised crime threat, and for Martin to have the convening power and to work across Whitehall on a range of issues. So it provides clarity, and we have more than enough to get on with in the NCA tackling the organised crime element.
So I sit on Martin's board, so strategically heavily involved, and I've got members of my team that sit within the operational delivery groups. I speak from a personal point of view that I see his strategic plans over the next few years, and they make absolute sense in terms of what he's seeking to achieve for the Border Security Command. And it feels like, exactly as Rob has just said, that coordination is there, and it's driving a system response across law enforcement and wider.
Sarah, last minute to you.
I would say that although we contribute to the Border Security Command as an independent prosecuting authority, obviously we can't be tasked or directed, but we do value the collaborative work that we can do within that sphere.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This this brings us to the end of the time allocated for the committee to ask questions. On behalf of the committee, I'd like to thank our witnesses for their evidence. Thank you very much, and for your service.
He says that he thinks it's possible.
I thought that's a but
yeah. Oh.
Thank you. We will now hear oral evidence from the former Director General UK Border Force, Migration Watch UK and the Centre for Policy Studies. We have until 3:20 for this panel. Please could witnesses briefly introduce themselves for the record.
Karl Williams, I'm the Research Director at the Centre for Policy Studies, and I've written several reports on legal and illegal migration.
Hello, my name's Tony Smith. I am a former Director General of the UK Border Force, but I've spent 40 years in the Home Office, from Immigration Officer right the way up to DG Border Force between 72 and 2013.
I'm Mehmet, Chairman of Migration Watch. I'm also a former diplomat and a former immigration officer.
Thank you. I call Shadow Minister Matt Vickers.
Nice and broad one. Are there any provisions you would like to see added to this bill to strengthen our ability to drive down illegal crossings?
Sorry, Chair, I'm a bit hard of hearing.
Apparently the laptop in front of the microphone. Are there any provisions that it's a nice broad question, any provisions you would like to see added to this bill to strengthen our ability to drive down illegal crossings?
May I just make a few remarks, or would that be acceptable?
We have such a limited amount of time.
Yes, I appreciate that.
If you could answer the question, that would be great. Briefly, please.
The bill, I welcome it in many respects. I think it's the sort of thing that needed to be done, that is happening. I welcome the coordination across government that is going to take place. I think that the potential cooperation with the EU and EU member states, that's also to be welcomed. The setting up of the Border Security Command and Commander, I think that's all, what can one say? It will be helpful. My only gripe, if I can put it that way, is I disagree strongly about the Safety of Rwanda Asylum and Immigration Act being repealed. I think that's a mistake. I also think that the repeal of certain parts of the Illegal Migration Act are also a mistake, but again, that's a personal thing, and I'm happy to explain why in a moment. I wonder whether primary legislation was necessary in order to do a lot of what is happening, but we are where we are. I think that illegal immigration, if I can use the term illegal, but whatever we may call it, there is going to be, if anything, a degree of encouragement by removal of the Rwanda Act, and that I think is unfortunate. There's a lot of people who are entering the EU. There were 240,000 entering illegally, declared last year. A lot of those will end up coming to us. There is no deterrence because once they arrive here, the likelihood is they will be able to stay. I believe that the only deterrence is by restricting arrival, constraining and removing quickly. That will send the right messages. I don't think there's anything in the bill at the moment that would suggest that that is going to happen.
Thank you.
That's broadly my view.
Tony and Karl, anything on this?
So, yeah, I mean, looking at the clauses sort of in the chunks that they're in the bill, I mean, the first thing, the Border Security Commander struck me as it's going to be another civil servant. I think it's going to be a Director General post in the Home Office. I mean, I was one of those, and we already have quite a lot of those. and I'm not sure that he's actually going to be able to command anything. I think he's probably going to be more a coordinator. I would like to see him and his team have law enforcement powers, so they've got powers to arrest and detain, same as officers have in the Border Force, in National Crime Agency, Immigration Enforcement. I think that whole governance structure does need attention, so it does need someone to pull it all together. But so I'm not sure that we've pitched that right, that post right in immigration law enforcement teams. I think on his reporting requirements that you've put in, I think he does need to regularly publish details of irregular arrivals by way of nationality, age, provide regular updates as to where they are in the process, so that we can all see where, if there are logjams in the process from arrival to either removal or grant, we can check the timelines. I think they've already got a dashboard in the Home Office that does that, so I presume he will be able to take responsibility for that. And I would also like to follow up on the point that Mehmet made about removals and data on removals and the numbers of people who could be excluded currently under the NABA, under the National Borders Act, because they've come from a safe third country. That's still there, but we don't know the data of how many of those are actually on a case-by-case being removed. So I would like to see a country list of all the countries that are where we can remove people to, both for safe third country, for source countries, but also for third countries. Now, we know France won't take, or the EU won't take third country returns. In fact, without Rwanda, I don't think there are any countries that will take third country returns. There are countries that will take their own nationals back, but under this new system where we've done away with SORA and most of the IMA, then there doesn't seem to be a third country option outlet. Therefore, those people that come here from Iran or Iraq or Syria or Afghanistan know on the other side of the channel they need only get in the British territorial waters, and they will probably be allowed to stay in the UK, because they maybe well get asylum, but even if they don't, it's impossible to return them for one reason or another. So I'm really interested in that returns piece. I'm really keen on data from mobile devices to be captured. Some of them do keep their mobile phones. That data is being used for prosecution purposes only. I think that should be made available to officials who are considering their asylum. Quite often there's passport data on there, identity data, age data, travel history data, all data that we would really usefully have to consider an asylum application that's being held on those phones. So I think we need legislation to do that, and I would also use mobile devices to track people on bail who are given bail, so that we can use the tracker to know where they are in the event of an adverse decision from the Home Office, that we will be able to find them. At the moment we don't have powers to do that because of the Regulatory Powers Act. I would like to see an amendment that enabled that to happen. We know the tagging systems haven't really worked, and in the unlikely event, I don't expect the government will, but in the unlikely event that we were able to keep SORA or the Rwanda plan, then we really need to look, I think, at options for offshoring asylum claims, where we could send people who have arrived from a safe third country, if we can't send them back there, to another safe country, ergo Rwanda, where they could be resettled safely and would not add to the continuing flow of arrivals by small boat, not just by small boat, but from France. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anything to add on that, Karl?
Yeah, just two brief points to reinforce what Tony was saying. This bill to me feels like it focuses on disruption and interdiction of routes of entering the country illegally. It doesn't do much on deterrence. I think, as the impact assessment itself says, on Pillar 3, the changes to measures around going after the gangs, it's very uncertain what outcome this will be. That's because there isn't an evidence base here. The only country that's succeeding in stopping small boats has been Australia. There was some interdiction involved there, working with Indonesia, but primarily it was about the offshoring agreement, which was a major plank of their deterrence. So I'd like to see deterrence measures added into this, not just disruption. Secondly, on the border command, to reinforce what Tony was saying, data information here is really important. Migration policy generally, legal and illegal, has been bedeviled by very poor quality government data. It seems the new border security command is going to have limited ability to have operational control, but one thing I would like to see them have is powers to access and pull together data so that we can have a much better picture of...
Thank you. Yeah.
Are there any lessons from abroad that we're failing to learn at this point with this bill?
So, I mean, one thing that I have raised is the possibility of a biometric entry-exit system in this country, which we don't have, but at the weight, I do chair a lot of conferences around the world on border developments, border security, border technologies, if you like. Your face will become your passport sooner or later, sooner rather in some countries than here, in that we could, if we had the powers and authorities, capture just a digital image, which is a biometric of everybody entering and exiting the country, require the carriers to do likewise. We don't have physical embarkation controls. This is happening in America, it's happening in Dubai, it's happening in Singapore. We're going to Curacao, where they've got an actual walk-through border there now. And all it does is capture your face, it matches you to the API data that you've already got, uploads it into the cloud, recognises you straight away, you've got a more seamless border, but it'll give you things like proper figures on who's in this country and who isn't. Your net migration figures will be a lot more accurate than they are currently, provided that we have the powers to capture and retain those facial images on everybody. That means UK passports, Irish passport, ETA and visa and permanent residence. But I think that's achievable, and I'd love to see that happening in this country.
Thank you very much.
Any more to add on that otherwise? Yeah.
Thanks, Minister. Minister Dame Angela Eagle.
Thank you very much. Migration Watch and their website, it says that you're worried about population projections and you worry about a significant fall in the percentage of the indigenous white British population. Can you explain what your worry is and define what the indigenous white population is, please?
First of all, I'm a first-generation migrant. I came here as an 8-year-old. I've been here since the mid-50s. The population, the immigrant ethnic minority element of the population in those days was something like 4%. In the 1951 census, it was actually 3.9%. It is now 25%, and that has substantially happened over the last 30 years. What worries me, if that's the right word, is the fact that there are people being added to the population, and migration is the only driver of population increase at the moment, which is what it is. And I know you've got David Coleman coming up next, and he will tell you a great deal more about what the likely evolution of the population and the demographic mix is going to be. That is my concern. Having arrived here as a migrant and accepted and joined this country and made it my own, I see it now changing very rapidly into something that the majority of people in this country do not want to happen.
Well, you still haven't told us what indigenous means, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister. Will Forrester.
Thank you. Two questions, if I may. Karl, you talked about this bill doesn't have very much deterrence in it. What's your view on safe legal routes? So if we had safe legal routes, wouldn't that deter people having unsafe illegal routes? And Tony, you talked about sort of your perfect solution to borders. You didn't mention the cost of it. Have you got an idea of the setup cost and the running cost of it? Thank you.
So we do have safe and legal routes, is the short answer. The new Home Office immigration data that was published this morning pointed out that last year 79,000 people arrived from safe and legal routes. Since 2020 we've had about 550,000, maybe slightly more, arrive from safe and legal routes. Whether that's Ukraine, Hong Kong, the Afghan resettlement schemes, new people arriving through the UN programs and through Syria, and yet this hasn't stopped the crossings. I think the fundamental problem is here, there is always going to be more demand to come to this country than we would probably be willing to allow for in safe and legal routes. Just one stat on that, a couple of years ago Gallup did a very wide-ranging poll of attitudes on migration and found that globally about 900 million adults would migrate given the opportunity. 30 million of those people in fact put Britain as their first choice. there is always going to be a longer queue to get in than we have capacity for in any one given time period, is my view.
I don't have a detailed financial breakdown for you, but I can say the direction of travel in the UK and around the world is to take away officers from the border and to automate a lot of the processes. We are doing that here already. We move, I think, more people through e-gates than any other country does. So this is an automated border which will in itself provide with reductions in the numbers of officers required to do frontline routine tasks, which they really don't want to do, and enable them to target those people that they really want to focus on. So I think probably, if you were to do that in detail analysis, you'd probably find it would be cost neutral in the end.
Okay. If I may, one quick follow-up. Thank you for the answer, Cole. Are you suggesting that we should have more schemes like the Ukrainian scheme to combat the small boats issue?
I don't think it combats. I don't think it is a disincentive. I think the ideal solution is once we have control over the small boats and therefore who's coming into this country, we can have a serious conversation about expanding safe and legal routes if we want and what that might look like and what other parts of the world we might want to help. But I think so much resource is now sucked up dealing with the downstream consequences of the channel crossings, the hotel bills, etc. This is a sequence of things. I don't think a safe and legal route in itself is in any way a disincentive to trying to come.
Thank you. Jade Bottrill.
Thanks, Chair. All three of you have expressed disappointment to seeing us scrap the Rwanda scheme as part of this bill. Can I just ask, what part of the 700 million spent by the previous government do you think was good value for money for the taxpayer?
I don't think any of it was good value for money for the taxpayer, was it? I mean, the history speaks for itself and the record, but I think we need to think why it didn't work. I think we need to look at the reasoning behind why it took 3 years, really, to try and get this process going. There was an awful lot of work done in Rwanda and in the Home Office, I know, to try and make this happen, but it was subject to continual legal challenges. And those legal challenges were made both in Europe and in the domestic ports and by judicial reviews. There were flights lined up on a number of occasions that did not happen, and a lot of money was therefore wasted in the process. The other point, I'm not a big fan of the Illegal Migration Act. Actually, I think some of it was cumbersome because it put all of the eggs in the Rwanda basket. Rwanda was a limited programme. Obviously, we could not send everybody to Rwanda, but under the NABA, you had the option to triage and put some people into the Rwanda bucket if you wanted to. Those hard country removers where you couldn't remove them anywhere else, you had that option, but you could still do what you're doing now and process people from places like Turkey and Albania and put them through the asylum system and return them to source. I think losing that triage option is going to be a big drawback, and it's going to cost a lot more money in the long run because the intake will continue to come, and then you'll have to rack up the associated asylum costs, accommodation costs and settlement costs that will run along with that.
I would add to that, value compared to what? There's one argument around the counterfactuals if you get deterrence. But also I would refer to the OBR's analysis last summer on the fiscal impacts of migration. And they estimate that a low-skilled migrant, or low-wage migrant as they put it, will represent a lifetime net fiscal cost to the taxpayer of around £600,000. We know from analysis in Denmark and the Netherlands and other European countries that asylum seekers' lifetime fiscal costs tend to be steeper than that. But even on the basis of the OBR analysis, you say everyone will end up in work. If you're getting 35,000 people across the year, which is roughly where we were last year, at that sort of cost range, we're talking, what, 50, 60 billion pounds of lifetime cost. So compared to that, 700 billion pounds. It depends on what timescale you're looking over.
Thank you. Pete Wishart.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just wondering if the panel would agree with me that there's going to be increasing demand to come to the UK from right across the world. We're not going to deal with war-torn situations. We're not going to deal with oppression and absolute poverty. So people are going to continue to move in. The movement of peoples has never been so profound as it has been in the last decade. So I don't know exactly how you plan to stop that, but if I'm unfairly characterising your view, you could correct me, but your view is it shouldn't get into the UK and they should be stopped either in the sea or the minute they arrive in the UK, and at that point they should be booted out to somewhere, if that's not Rwanda, some other favourable other country, or just put back to country of source. Is that roughly your view? Just shake your head or nod. Is that roughly your view? Yeah. Okay, that's fine. So I'm just wondering, have you even the slightest scintilla of sympathy, compassion and concern about these poor, wretched souls who end up on our shores with absolutely nothing, that have fled oppression, warfare and extreme poverty? So, I mean, if I can come back, I do have sympathy with them. I do sympathise. I would probably, many of us I suspect would do the same thing. My issue is they have travelled through a great many countries to make it to the UK. We used to have the UNHCR resettlement programme when we did have control of our borders. I was a big fan of that. I went to Canada and studied it for 3 years, where you are actually searching the world, working with the UNHCR to identify the most vulnerable people and set a cap on the numbers that you can take. And that was going in Canada, that was going in Australia, the UK. You look at the UNHCR website and see the numbers of people that are going through that programme now. They're not getting resettled, and the reason they're not is because the business model's been taken over by the smugglers. And that's why we're getting large numbers of young men who can afford to cross multiple borders and pay smugglers to get here. So I would like to see a return to the system where we have got control of those irregular routes, and then we can start looking, as Karl said, at reintroducing the UNHCR resettlement programmes, go to the UNHCR and take a certain quota into the UK in a managed way.
There are, just out of Syria recently, out of Gaza, there are going to be potentially 2 million people who would like some comfort. So they would like to move to somewhere a bit more convivial than Gaza is at the moment. But why is it, if I may ask the question, why is it assumed that because people like us advocate control and discouraging people a lot of the time from risking their lives, not just across the channel, but by living rough as they do, why is discouraging them from coming in some way, inhuman and insensitive and unkind?
I'm asking your response to the people who arrive on the shores, whether you feel empathy, compassion, or concern about
we do, and even in my day as an immigration officer 50 years ago, that was exactly what we did. Tony, he rose to run the show, but I would argue that we had far more leeway in the 70s as individual immigration officers, humble immigration officers, very junior. We were properly trained and we were monitored, and we did things in a way that was entirely within the law, and we dealt with people humanely. That doesn't mean that won't happen because we're saying, no, you shouldn't jump into a dinghy and make your way over here.
Thank you. Joe White.
Thank you, Chair. From the moment that the Rwanda deal was signed until the moment it was scrapped, 84,000 people arrived here on boats. So how can you define that as a deterrent?
So, go on, you go, then I'll catch up with the question, because I didn't quite hear.
We may well be saying the same thing, but I mean, the question was, the Rwanda plan didn't deter anybody because we still had 84,000. I think the reason for that is because it was never in fact implemented. So smugglers, the intelligence coming across from Calais was that smugglers and the migrants did never believe that it was going to happen. But once it became clearer that the Safety of Rwanda Act had passed, and it may well become a reality, then there was intelligence to suggest that some people were thinking twice about getting into dinghies, some displacement into Ireland as a result of that. But of course we'll never know now because we never actually implemented it. What I would have liked to see, I know we had a change of government, and clearly the new government made it very clear they were going to abolish the Rwanda plan, so we are where we are. But I would have liked to have seen an opportunity to see what would have happened if we had started at least some removals. We had flights ready to go. If we had started some removals, what that impact would have had on the incoming population. And I'm afraid we will never know now. So yes, clearly we didn't actually remove hardly anybody to Rwanda in the end. I accept that. But I would have liked to at least have seen us try to do that to see if it had an impact.
Thank you.
I would also say that it was never going to be the solution. It wasn't going to be the way to stop those people jumping into boats coming across. But it was going to help. There needed to be other changes, and I would argue that the ECHR, which we're not going to resolve from any time soon, I appreciate that. But while that is there, then it makes it very difficult to be certain that people will be dissuaded. Some will be, and some would have been, and we know that some were already being deterred, and I'm afraid it was a pity that the Rwanda deal went.
A bit today about the clauses. I think they're 13.3 and 14.4 exempting NGOs from criminal charges for helping asylum seekers cross the channel. What do you think of those?
Well, I think if we are talking about what deterrents we might need or what pull factors there are, clearly having charities that are in some circumstances facilitating people crossing the channel is going to be an extra pull factor. Probably a small one in the grand scheme of things, but it is there. And what I'm thinking of here are organisations such as Care for Calais, who are providing, for example, phone charging services to migrants who are waiting in the sand dunes and the camps around the beaches where the crossings are made. They can recharge their phones, then they are therefore in contact with the smuggling gangs. So I think there is a hole in the system that needs to be closed, and I don't think this bill does it.
Thank you. I just wanted to say that I think there are charities and charities. There are different charities that some of them are not in any way involved in facilitation. It's a pure care in the community, exercise function in Calais. But I think there are other charities who are a little bit more mischievous, who might be helping people with their, what to say when you're near the border, how to present your asylum claim, how to get to a beach which might not be patrolled, which I think are a bit more mischievous. So I think I'd like to see more work done on that.
Thank you. Becky Gittins.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much to the panel for your spirited contributions so far. We obviously know that the processing of asylum claims ground to a halt under the previous government, due in part to the Rwanda scheme and to the IAM. That being the route that, other than the 4 that went to Rwanda, people are either granted asylum or returned to the country from which they came. We also know the impact of the asylum system sort of grinding to a halt on our communities. Massive influx of people being placed for sort of indefinite periods in asylum hotels, and also the impact that this had on our local authorities and their ability to therefore provide services to the rest of our community. Given that this bill does clearly provide a deterrent to smugglers and the business around people smuggling, the criminal gangs in the channel, in the way of disrupting their activity, greater expense, etc. Why is it that we've still heard representations from a few of our, well, I think two or three of you outright said, but all seem to be broadly supportive of Rwanda. Why, given those facts, do you still think it's a mistake to be repealing those acts within this bill?
There's a Nationality and Borders Act of 2022, there's the Illegal Migration Act of 2023. I said earlier I was not a great fan of the IMA because of the very reasons that you stated, because it brought in clauses, it brought in the ban too early, so people were being banned from re-entering this country before we'd even removed them. And that was impacting on port cases. It was a hugely difficult time because that law actually put all of the eggs in the Rwanda basket, and as you say, left increasing in numbers of boat people were being served with notice that you're going to Rwanda when they were never going to go to Rwanda. They were going into the system you described, so I don't think that was a very good idea. I think what happened with the NABA, if we'd have put the IMA to one side and the duty to remove, and we'd have stuck with NABA, and then we had SORA, the safety of SORA would have turbocharged NABA, and it would have given you that triage option to either accept people into your asylum system quickly and process them, which you're doing now. But you could have done that with some of them. But for the others, where you wanted to make a point that it's not okay to come across in a small boat and get to stay in the UK, you could have sent some of them to Rwanda. And that's, I think, what we could have done under Naba and Sora, and I think the IMA disrupted that. That's my view.
And I just add to that, I suppose the asylum backlog of inadmissible people is a function of the disjunction between different parts of the legislation, the implementation moving at different speeds. Obviously, the intention at the beginning was we'd have the flights going off in, I think it was, February, January 2023, when the ECHR injunction stopped the first flight. And I think that derailed it. And you could have had conceivably a situation where a combination of some offshoring and the deterrent effect of that would have meant the backlog of inadmissible cases did not grow. Obviously, the fact that then Miranda got stalled through the courts for a couple of years and then just didn't happen at all meant inevitably that mountain was going to increase. And that was at that point locked in.
Thank you. Mike Tapp.
Thank you, Chair. A couple of questions for Mr. Smith, if you will. Going back to some of your earlier comments, you spoke about quite enthusiastically biometric collection at the borders. Are you aware that we're looking at the new entry-exit system with biometric collection coming in this year? That's the first question. The second, you spoke quite negatively about the Border Security Command. Now, I believe from your profile that you retired in 2013, is that correct? Now, 12 years on, we've had the DG of the National Crime Agency in before you, who spoke very enthusiastically about the Border Security Command and this bill. Have you spoken to them since you retired?
No, I haven't spoken to the DG of the National Crime Agency. I'm retired, so probably different constraints apply to what I can say to what you can say when you're still working for the government. But I mean, I would say that I am very close to Border Force Immigration Enforcement, a lot of my former colleagues who are still working. I did go out on the boats with them last year. I'm very much in touch with what's going on there. I worked under the UK Border Agency. We had agency status. We were arm's length from government. I had specific removal targets that I had to deliver. I had end-to-end teams. I had front-end teams, asylum teams, immigration enforcement teams in a region working a case from start to finish with quite rigorous case conclusion targets. So I liked that system because I thought it worked. It got broken up into silos. We now have Directors General for Border Force, Immigration Enforcement, Migration and Borders, Homeland Security. Now we're putting another one in for Border Security Command. I think that's quite a jumbled mirage of civil servants. If you've got the crime agency, and that's NCA, the police, and the security services. It's a really so I can see why you want a coordinator. I can see why you want a coordinator. That's what he is, though. He's not commander. I was gold commander for the UKBA London 2012 Olympic. I was in charge, basically. I had a Home Secretary. Obviously, I was answering to her on decision-making. But it came to me because I had command over all those units. Now you haven't, because you've got... The Home Office is very gradist, and you've got Directors General for a whole different bunch of silos. It's going to be a heck of a job for the new security commander to actually direct activities on those agencies that have other priorities and other responsibilities, I think. So that's why I would like to see them have, agency powers, arrest powers, enforcement powers, and to have a whole look at that whole structure about border force enforcement, migration and borders, and see, is this too unwieldy? And can we have a more streamlined process where we have got somebody calling the shots?
Thank you. Obviously differing to those that are currently serving. And on the biometric checks, are you aware that we've got a new system?
So I know you've got an order coming in next week which does allow biometrics to be captured. That's going through, but I don't think it goes far enough.
So there's a new entry-exit system Europe-wide which will be implemented.
Oh, the EU one?
Yeah,
yeah, exactly, the EES system, that's what I mean. So the EES...
Here, at our borders.
No, we're not.
Yes, we are.
Well, we haven't got an entry-exit system. We have
so
not got a biometric
entry.
No, we haven't. We've not got a biometric entry-exit system. The EU are bringing in EES, the entry-exit system, which means Brits will have to give their biometrics on entry and exit. We're bringing in the ETA, an Electronic Travel Authority, but that's different to an entry-exit system.
Thank you.
Thank you. Tom Hayes.
Thank you, Chair. Questions for Mr. Williams. Sorry, is it Dr. Williams? No, okay, sorry. Mr. Williams then. So I spoke with Dr. Walsh in a previous testimony and I asked him the question, whether he thought it was difficult to make emphatic assessments of the fiscal burden of migration given the quality of the data available. There's a February 2025 report which you've authored, which makes broadly the same points about some of the quality gaps that are there. I'd welcome you talking a little bit about the gaps in that data, which obviously affects the ability to make emphatic assessments. And then I also wanted to ask you about that report. So in a previous answer, you raised the importance of counterfactuals. In your report, did you consider counterfactuals in reaching your overall recommendations and assessments, such as the fact that migrants might move up the wage and skills distribution, that they won't always remain at low pay, that in the absence of these migrant workers, there would need to be other people who could do their work, for instance, in the health and care settings? Did you consider the economic impacts of having nobody in those roles to do that health and care, and whether that would affect the worklessness in our country? Did you consider things like whether there was a reallocation of British workers into higher skill and higher wage jobs as a consequence of those migrant workers? And maybe things like the economic impacts of potentially more people doing unpaid care because there was a lack of paid carers. Now, I ask these questions not because I feel like we should rely on migrant workers. I don't. But I ask these questions because your report has been lauded by the Shadow Home Secretary and other Conservative members of Parliament, and I want to make sure that if it is being used as a point of reference, that the data and the assessments have got integrity. And I wonder whether, if you were to consider those counterfactuals, it might affect what your report says.
Yes. So, first point, we are talking about the indefinite leave to remain report that came out a couple of months ago, not the life report from last year.
Oh, I've forgotten the name of it. Here to Stay?
Yes, that's the one, yes.
That's the one.
Okay, so that is purely looking at fiscal impact. There is some analysis, which I can reference in a minute, on the broader economic picture in the previous report, but this was more tightly focused in.
But inevitably the counterfactuals would have an impact on the fiscal burden carried by the state.
Indeed, yes. And the counterfactuals we did think about were different levels of stay rates and different rates among different wage profiles. In terms of migrants earning more as they go through the system, that clearly does happen to some extent, whether through out-migration or through career progression. In conducting that analysis, we stuck to the fiscal profiles used by the OBR, because, as you say, the data quality around this is fairly poor, and that was the best there was, rather than trying to construct our own sort of, this will be the ingoings and outgoings as they progress over their life course in the UK. And the OBR does model it by age, so they do capture the different sort of wage contributions that you make at different points in your life, which will be higher in some points and lower in others, and they do capture the different burdens of, for example, healthcare in old age. In terms of the quality of the data, yes, I'm really glad you phrased that. I think we've repeatedly pointed out, as has the Government Bank of England and the ONS, that the labour force survey is very broken. And I think in that report and previous reports, we have always pushed on the point that we need better data. Everyone needs better data. And this is this one area where I think there is broad consensus, whether you're a restrictionist or you want more migration or whatever else.
I guess
the standard reference here is to Denmark and the Netherlands.
And I guess, would you feel cautious about members of Parliament emphatically assessing that there would be a fiscal burden of 234 billion over the lifetime, as your report concludes, based on those concerns that you have about data, but also the fact that consideration of some of those counterfactuals, and there could be many, many more I list, would actually impact on that overall figure?
The report is very clear about the assumptions we've made at various points and the unknowns. And with any modelling exercise, whether it's you're conducting a fiscal model of an effect of a tax change or whatever else, you have to make assumptions about reasonable assumptions.
We've got 20 seconds left, sorry.
Thank you.
Okay.
You didn't have to stop straight away. We just have 20 seconds.
Oh, in which case, carry
on. Thank you very much. Order. That brings us to the end of the time allocated for the committee to ask questions. On behalf of the committee, I thank our witnesses for their evidence. Thank you very much. Thank you.
God, no, you're right.
Hi, good afternoon. We will now hear evidence from David Coleman, Emeritus Professor of Demography, University of Oxford. We have until 3:40 p.m. for this witness. Could the witness please introduce himself for the record? Can you hear me okay? Sorry. Could you please introduce yourself briefly for the record?
Yes, of course. My name is David Coleman. I'm Emeritus Professor of Demography in the University of Oxford. I've been retired for over 10 years, and I interest myself in all sorts of aspects of demography, not just migration, but also mortality, fertility, and all the other things that we play with.
Thank you very much. I call Shadow Minister Matt Vickers.
Yeah, do you have any particular concerns about this bill as it's drafted, or any suggested ways in which it might be improved to achieve its ends?
Well, the sad fact is that I do have reservations about the bill, and I don't have any magical solutions to put that right. I'm sorry to say, it is, after all, an intractable problem, this question of asylum and migration. My concerns are that it's, well, we have to, we're forced to start, to restart or intensify a war which we may not easily win, rather similar, as I suggested in my note, to the war against drugs. It'll be difficult, probably perpetual, probably indecisive. It'll have some effect. It'll consume a great deal of effort. It may involve unkindness to asylum seekers and risk possibly to those doing the investigations. And it's I think, very much a second best to the idea of trying to deter migration for asylum claiming in the first place. That, of course, was dismissed by the present government as being unfeasible, unworkable, unkind, and so the Rwanda scheme was scrapped. But that, although it sounds rather brutal, seems to me to be the only obvious way of deterring movement to Britain by making the movement to Britain unattractive. And the obvious way of doing that is to divert at least some of the claimants to somewhere where they will be safe, but where they will not enjoy the benefits of being in a rich country. I mean, there are four ways of dealing with this issue, are there not? One is to have open borders so everyone who wants to come can come. There are two ways of being nasty. One is being nasty to the smugglers themselves, which is what this bill is primarily about, I suppose. The other is being rather nasty to people who wish to claim asylum. which the previous policy was doing, or you could also have special routes of selected people who can be investigated possibly by the UNHCR and then admitted. And that's been ruled out by the government for the time being, as far as I can make out.
Are there any lessons from abroad that we're failing to learn?
Well, the lesson that everyone cites, I suppose, is the example of Australia, which, depending on which government is in power, had and has a policy of diverting people right across the other side of the Pacific to an island where they were notionally safe, but where they were not enjoying being in Australia. And that is supported or not supported depending on which government is in power, which is one of the problems about migration policy. Generally speaking, that whether the doors are tight shut or half open or fully open depends very much on the swings and balances of electoral change, and it's rather unpredictable. But that I think is inevitable.
Thank you. Minister Dame Angela Eagle.
Thank you very much. Professor Coleman, are you a member of the Galton Institute?
No, well, yes and no. The Galton Institute doesn't exist anymore. The Galton Institute has changed its name to the Adelphi Forum on Genetics.
But it's a eugenics
organisation. No, it isn't. It's devoted to genetics research and has conferences every year on genetics research and promotes research into that, and has a small grant fund which people can apply for, and it is a very pucker organisation. And if you have any doubts about it, can I suggest that you have a look at their publications and the website? You will find something by me on that, which is only slightly connected with genetics. It's a new light on old Britons. It's about paleontology and human evolution. That's one of the things that the organisation was interested in. You're quite right that it started off as the Eugenics Society, and before that it was the Eugenics Education Society. That was in the days when progressives of every kind were clustered around to support eugenic ideas because they were thought to be improving and beneficial to society.
But of course, I think that eugenics was actually discredited, was it not, because of the rise of Nazi Germany and the Holocaust?
Oh, it got a terribly bad name for that reason. Exactly so, yes, and that's why as over the last century, opinion has moved against using that word, using those notions. But it's nothing to do with asylum seeking, if I may respectfully point out.
And do you believe in universal human rights, that all human beings are equal and deserving of universal human rights?
Well, I suppose as a rather bad Christian, I'm bound to believe that. But the problem about human rights definitions is that they tend to be infinitely extendable. And all kinds of entitlements, which started off as being universally accepted by almost everyone of goodwill, tend to get expanded beyond reason.
I think you mentioned that trying to deal with the problems of immigration, at least illegal or irregular immigration, deal with in some ways being nasty to smugglers, which this bill is, but also then nasty to asylum seekers. Do you want to talk about what you mean by that?
Well, I mean that to make life less attractive, the prospect of life in the country of intended asylum less attractive than otherwise might be the case, and that's what the Rwanda policy was. I mean, I suppose slightly tongue-in-cheek to call it being nasty, but it certainly is not the same thing as being welcoming, is it? And the idea of the Rwanda bill was to secure the safety from persecution and risk of death of asylum seekers, which is the aim of asylum, without admitting them to Britain and all the benefits of being in a rich country.
But the reality was that we had tens of thousands of people who'd arrived who couldn't be processed because of the Illegal Migration Act and the flaws in that, just living in hotels for forever, not being able to be processed, not being able to be sent anywhere else. How is that a solution to the issues that we're trying to deal with?
Well, it was never... I'm not here to defend the Rwanda policy, or I think it in principle, had some merit. But that is a problem which would arise whether there was a Rwanda policy or an illegal immigration act or not, because of the sheer pressure of asylum seeking from all corners of the world. That has been the case in the past for a long time, and it will continue to be the case with now asylum claims up to 99,000 in the last year. It's not just to do with the Illegal Immigration Act. It's a worldwide process.
Of course, asylum claims are up because they weren't being processed, and now they are. But that's dealing with a backlog that was caused by the problems with the Illegal Migration Act. I do not know how important the Illegal Migration Act was in increasing the number of the backlog, to be perfectly honest. In the past, it's been the same height without the Illegal Immigration Act. It was about 15 years ago, 20 years ago, it was also 90,000 per year, and that was way before any of the present legislation, or the past legislation, rather, was enacted.
Thank you very much. Pete Wishart.
Thank you. I was actually very excited when I found there was a professor of demography coming to this panel. I've got a particular interest in population demography.
Oh, good.
And using your vast knowledge of the subject, could you explain to the committee what the population and demographic trends will be for practically every European nation towards the middle part of the century and the end of the century, and how will these nations cope with the population stagnation and the population decline and the assorted problems with a smaller working age workforce supporting an older generation with a falling birth rate around the world? What will they do in order to deal with that?
Well, this is a formidable tutorial group to try and give such an answer to. If I could say with any kind of confidence what was going to happen by the middle of the century, I deserve a Nobel Prize.
Professor, you must know.
But I can do my best. The present situation, as you obviously are suggesting, is rather dire from the point of view of domestic demography. The fact that the so-called total fertility is down to 1.44 and may fall further. And therefore, this presages considerable population ageing and decline should it continue. But perhaps I, at the risk of being technical and boring, point out that this measure, this total fertility, is a snapshot. All it is a calculation about on average, how many babies the average woman, if you can imagine an average woman, would produce over a lifetime if the current levels of age-specific fertility were to continue. That is to say, the same levels of birth rate, age 15 to 19, 20 to 24, and so on. If that continues at the present level, then what would happen in the long run? You get 1.44 babies. But this is a very volatile measure. It goes up and it goes down. Back in 2010, it was 1.94, which is really very healthy and probably as high as you can possibly get.
You need 2 children per woman.
Yes.
To sustain levels. I'm not telling a professor
or 2.1. This is true, although there is a risk of starting another hair. Can I suggest that some degree of population aging and population decline is tolerable, particularly when we're faced with a world whose habitable area is shrinking, and where the productivity of that world is declining, thanks to the inevitable level of global climate change. The last thing we want, it seems to me, anywhere, is population growth. and population stabilisation and population decline, as long as it's modest and as long as it eventually comes to an end, is, I think, to be welcomed. I've said that with colleagues on a number of occasions. But I do agree that the present level of fertility is very unsatisfactory. It would be much healthier if it were higher. One gets into perilous waters trying to persuade people to have more children. The important thing is to identify those obstacles which stand in the way of the family size that people keep on saying they want to have. And despite all the problems at the present time, opinion polls suggest that people still want to have almost 2 babies or even more than 2 babies on average. But they can't for all sorts of reasons. In this country, some of those reasons are very obvious. One of them is the atrocious cost of housing. House prices are now 9 times the level of the average income, compared with 3 or 4 times, which is normal in the past.
We've got 4 minutes left, and I've got 3 people to get.
Sorry. Forgive me. I ran away with myself. I'm so sorry.
Thank you. Margaret Millay.
Chair. Professor, the statement following on from what the Minister asked you, kind of that we've got to be mean or have open borders. And then I looked at your presentation and you've put number 9, make Britain unattractive again, and then you refer to the Rwanda policy. And then you say, you know, you don't really know. We had the National Crime Agency in before you were in, and they were quite optimistic at what the deterrent aspects of the bill are. Are you saying that you're not at all?
Well, I'm not, but at the moment it's after all, a matter of, to some extent, a matter of opinion. The sorts of measures which are being proposed in the bill are a development and an accentuation of what's being done already. After all, the government isn't doing nothing to try and moderate asylum seeking. It has already been, like the previous government, involved in discussions with our neighbours to try and come to an agreement on all sorts of aspects of migrant trafficking. And the bill is trying to ratchet that up reasonably. But so far, that those measures, admittedly not as intense as this bill wants to impose, have not been notably successful. And I drew a parallel with the war against drugs, which has an effect. It reduces the volume of drugs in circulation. It puts drug pushers in prison, but it also puts up the price of drugs, of course. And I think that there's a rather depressing parallel there.
Okay, thank you. Okay.
Chris Murray.
In 2018, the government was spending £18,000 per asylum seeker per year. Then they brought in the Illegal Migration Act, the Nationality and Borders Act, and the Safety of Rwanda Act. And by 2024, they were spending £47,000 per asylum seeker per year. If you've got any respect for public money at all, isn't it self-evident that this legislation has failed and we should try a different approach on immigration?
Well, that, I suppose, is the reason why the previous government wanted to try and do something very different indeed in the Rwanda policy, which is, you know, was never tried, might well have failed, but was certainly a different avenue, as you were not the one you had in mind, I'm sure. But nonetheless, it was a different way of doing it. By attacking the problem from a very different angle, from the question of demand rather than control.
Thank you. I had Tom Hayes, but we've literally got 20 seconds.
Could you, Professor Coleman, on any level accept the self-description of being a eugenicist?
No.
No. In which case, I'm going to use the rest of my time. Are you familiar with the...
Okay, sorry. Order. That brings us to, unfortunately, the end of the time allocated to the committee to ask questions. On behalf of the committee, I thank our witness for his evidence. Thank you.
Committee.
We will now hear oral evidence from Professor Brian Bell from King's College, London. We will have until 4 p.m. for this panel. Could the witness please briefly introduce himself for the record?
I am Professor Brian Bell. I'm the chair of the Government's Migration Advisory Committee.
Thank you very much. Call Shadow Minister Mike Vickers.
Do you think this bill will be effective in achieving its aims, and how could it be made more effective?
Well, I think I think it's fair to say it's an open question whether it will be effective. I think the evidence from lots of previous experiences is actually very hard to deter this kind of activity. But I suppose you've got to try everything you can and see what works. And if something doesn't work, you try something else. So I think I think in some sense it's an unanswerable question in some sense at this point. And it may be unanswerable in the long run, in that suppose that the bill is passed and small boat numbers go up. It doesn't prove the bill failed, because we don't know what the counterfactual is of what would have happened without the bill, and vice versa. If the numbers go down, it could have just been that the number of people coming who wanted to come to France and then come on to England had fallen. So I think it's going to be very difficult to directly observe the effect. I think whenever you think about these kind of issues, you always have to think about both the deterrence effect, which is the deterrence and sanction effect, which is what the bill is focused on, and then also how do you change the incentive, the underlying incentives.
And then, do you think there are any lessons that we're failing to learn from abroad? From abroad?
I don't think so, in the sense that I don't think there's any country that has experienced these kind of issues that have dealt with it particularly successfully. I mean, there are different approaches. Obviously, Australia has taken a different approach. I don't think any country would claim that they've really succeeded in significantly addressing this kind of problem. But to me, it is very much the same kind of problem as any sort of, in some sense, any criminal activity you get, that you can you can change the sanctions, you can change the effectiveness of the police. That has some effect. The evidence tends to suggest on this sort of thing it has a fairly small effect. The deterrence effect tends to be quite small often with these kind of policies. So often in the end, the right response will almost certainly be about changing the incentives as well, both on terms of what's the attraction to come to the UK, are there ways that we can encourage people to stay in France in this case, instead of wanting to make those journeys.
Thank you very much. Minister Dame Angela Eagle.
Thank you very much. Professor Bell, do you think that in a democracy it ought to be the elected members and the government that decide who can come to our country rather than criminals and people smugglers?
Yes.
Therefore, do you share my view that when we see the establishment along our borders of serious organised immigration criminals who are profiting greatly from their illicit activities and putting people's lives at risk, that we should try to do all we can to put a stop to it? Absolutely.
I mean, to me, that's true but that's sort of true of all crimes in some sense. If someone's committing a crime, you want to stop them doing it. I think the difficulty is, the question is, if you stop one criminal doing it, what happens? Is there a substitution effect where you just get a next organised crime organisation taking action? So the risk is that you may well succeed, but what the overall macro effect of that is maybe not as positive as you might hope.
But of course, that's not a reason for not doing it, is it?
Absolutely not.
And therefore, could you comment on whether you think that the new powers in this bill will have an effect on our ability as a political, as a society with a law and order, to crack down on some of this abuse?
I think it's likely to have some positive effect. It can't, I mean, in some sense, it can't have a negative effect, so it must have some positive effect. The difficulty is, I think almost everyone would accept it's impossible to judge ex ante what the size of that effect will be. But that sort of just tells you should try it and see how it works.
Well, we're trying to take evidence to see what people think about whether these things will be effective. I'm not asking you to sort of produce a crystal ball and tell us in advance, but I'm trying to get a handle on whether you think that this is an effort worth making, and it seems to me that you're saying it is.
It's an effort worth making, but I would caution that in other areas of police and crime activity, the impact of being tougher in terms of sanctions and new offences doesn't necessarily lead to very substantial changes in crime rates. If you look at the overall crime rate in the UK, it's almost certainly driven more by incentives and economic outcomes in the long run than it is by particular offences and statutes that are passed.
But do you think that it's desirable to try to use counter-terrorism style powers to disrupt so that we can prevent some of these crossings happening rather than wait until after people have died in the channel and then try to pick up the pieces?
Completely.
Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Will Foster.
In your view, how would the changes to HMRC data sharing improve border security?
So it's certainly not an area that I have expertise in. I'm confused as to how significant this will be. I mean, as I understand the bill, it will essentially allow HMRC to share customs data with other parties. It's not clear to me what that achieves. I think it would be wrong of me to imply that I have any particular operational understanding of how that will help the operations.
But for today, we've heard a lot about supply and demand factors on migration, which you do understand. Obviously, data sharing is meant to be one of the examples of this is our way as a country of clamping down on it. In your experience, do you think this has a de minimis impact?
So I think data sharing overall can be phenomenally valuable in terms of thinking about immigration more broadly, and certainly the Migration Advisory Committee have been very clear that we need to improve the data, and so we ourselves have access to data from HMRC that we find very useful on the legal migration side. I'm just not clear what data... The question is fundamentally, what data does HMRC hold that will provide useful information to border security in terms of stopping organised immigration gangs? And presumably the government think that there are some useful points then. I mean, again, my view would be, well, why wouldn't you try it and see if it does actually help? If it doesn't, then you're no worse off in some sense.
Thank you.
Thank you. Chris Murray.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for coming today. We've heard some evidence this morning about the Illegal Migration Act and the Safety Rwanda Act, where witnesses have called it a disaster, meltdown, fundamental system breakdown. Can I ask, what's your assessment of the Illegal Migration Act and the Rwanda Act on the functioning of the Home Office systems, also on the cost to the public purse? And then finally, how effective do you judge it to have been in reducing migrant numbers?
So perhaps I'll take those in almost reverse order. I don't think it was very effective. I think, again, I would caution that there's always this problem that you see something, you see a piece of legislation passing, and then you try and look at the numbers and guess whether it was the legislation that caused the change that you see. But other things were going on, so it's always very difficult to do that. But I think more broadly, the evidence that we have from people seeking asylum is that the exact nature of the rules that exist in the country they're going to are not big drivers of their decision to go to a particular country. So if you ask me to list, and indeed people have done this, they've asked asylum seekers to list the reasons they want to come to the UK. Very rarely are things like, oh, what's the legal system in operation for dealing with asylum claims? It's all about the fact that English is the most common language in the world and often the second language of these people. There's a diaspora in the country. Labour market opportunities are potentially better than some of the other countries. So those things are generally much more important than whether your asylum claim is going to be dealt with in Rwanda or not. And I don't think many people concern themselves with that. And I don't think the numbers suggest, certainly the numbers are not consistent with a story of very significant deterrence effect from the Rwanda bill. Of course, asylum seekers might be really clever and spot that it was probably going to be declared illegal by the Supreme Court, and so perhaps they just were prejudging the legality of the measures. In terms of the cost, it was staggering for a policy that was very unlikely to have significant deterrence effect. And I think the difficulty the previous government has was they could never actually tell you how many people they thought would be... I mean, it's not a deterrence effect if you're sending a few thousand people every year.
Or four.
What?
Or four.
Or four. Well, four voluntarily went. But if it had been implemented in full, there was never any guarantee that we would be able to... We certainly wouldn't have been able to send 100,000 a year to Rwanda. The Rwandans never going to accept that. So the cost was just astounding given the likely deterrence effect. And I think it illustrates a problem in the Home Office at the time, which is that there was very little rational thinking about what the costs and benefits of different policy was. My own personal view is that getting asylum claims dealt with more quickly would have been a much more effective use of public resources. It's actually in the interests of the British public, but it's also in the interest of asylum seekers, most of whose claim are accepted, actually, if we can get them through the system faster, get them approved if they are approved and into work and integrating within their communities, and if they're rejected, actually deport them, that would have been a much more useful use of public resources.
Thank you. Pete Wishart.
Thank you, Chair. I see that you're an expert in immigration and crime, and that's some of the work that you've been doing as part of the... So I'm just wondering, when you're looking at this bill, one of its main features, of course, is the new clauses concerning criminalisation. How many more asylum seekers do you think will be put through the criminal courts as a result of the new legislation, and how many members of gangs and those that do the people smuggling will be put through the courts? Roughly what would be the proportion of that?
So, I think the likelihood is that the proportions will be... I think the numbers will actually be quite small, and I think often these pieces of legislation... in some sense, a good piece of legislation is where you set a criminal offence that is so serious and the penalty is so severe that no one commits the crime. And so the risk that you think you failed because no one was convicted, but actually if you deterred the behaviour because of the, then that's succeeded. I think the reality is that if there are any convictions, it will be almost entirely asylum seekers that are convicted, and I don't see how the gangs will be convicted, because as I understand it, they're not on the boats.
It's not going to really impact and affect the gangs, and very few of them will actually be caught up in what's been presented here. I had a little exchange with the director of the National Crime Agency just in one of the previous sessions, and we had a dispute about piloting the boats, which is now, as you know, going to be an offence as part of the new legislation. In the last 3 years, there were 205 people convicted on that very basis, and it's not even in the bill. Is this something that we're likely to see more of, people convicted for steering a boat, probably because they're forced to or compelled to?
Well, I think that is the implication of the legislation, but as I understand it, there is a defence. Again, I'm not a lawyer, so I should be careful here, but as I understand, there is a defence in the legislation that would allow you to claim that you were essentially forced into doing it under sort of human slavery kind of conditions and so on.
Not according to the current numbers. If there's 205, that's a lot of people. Just for being compelled to drive a boat.
Thank you. Sorry, we've only got 8 minutes. Joe White.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for coming, Professor Bell. Just over a week ago, the government announced that there be no automatic right to British citizenship should you come here illegally by boat or by lorry. Do you think that will act as a potential deterrent for people coming here?
Again, I think it's probably not a very strong deterrent. Again, I think, just to repeat myself, I think all the evidence is that asylum claimants, when they think of where to essentially claim asylum, don't have detailed knowledge of the ins and outs of different countries' kind of procedures. They almost certainly don't have knowledge of what might happen in 5 to 10 years' time if you have the length of residence that you'd need to be able to apply for citizenship. So I'm not sure it will be a very significant deterrent. At the same time, I think it is important to recognise that citizenship is not a right. It should be viewed as a privilege that people should earn. And I think I think it is reasonable for the government to take the view that citizenship, that right, should not be given to certain people. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. That seems to me a legitimate observation.
Thank you very much. Katie Lowe.
Perhaps on a related note to that, Professor, you've talked about incentives a couple of times and mentioned a couple of reasons why people don't come over from France, but what's your sense of why people do and whether those incentives can be disrupted?
Yep. Well, so some of these incentives you wouldn't want to disrupt. So, for example, the unemployment rate in France at the moment is 7.8% and it's 4.4% in the UK. And the gap is slightly larger for young people than for the population as a whole. I'm sure the government wouldn't want to change that incentive, although the French probably would. And so there are some that, if you have a buoyant economy relative to your neighbour, at least in the labour market, that's an incentive. I think there's an incentive in terms of, things that you wouldn't necessarily want to change. The English language is really important as a pull factor in some sense, and the fact that there are diaspora already in the country. The other thing I would say is that there tends to be some evidence that the UK has been somewhat more successful in France at integrating immigrants into society, particularly second-generation immigrants. And so there's some evidence, at least, that where employment rates are always very poor, relative to natives, employment rates tend to be very poor for first-generation immigrants. That gap narrows quite a bit in the UK when you look at second-generation immigrants. That's less true in France. And so there may be, people may think actually the opportunities are better here. And then I think probably the area where I do think the government could take action, and they are with the Employment Rights Bill, is that we have lots of employment rights in this country but don't bother enforcing any of them really, because we just don't spend money on HMRC minimum wage enforcement teams, and the Gang Mass and Labour Abuse Authority doesn't have enough money to employ people to do all the work they need to do. And so I think if the Fair Work agency can take over and actually be beefed up, then we can enforce labour standards a bit more. And that may discourage people to come, because I think one of the attractions of coming to the UK is our looser labour market in terms of our enforcement of rules makes it easier to employ people who are here irregularly.
So make it harder to work legally or outside the laws.
Tom Hayes.
Thanks. My questions are speculative. So, first of all, are you familiar with a report by the Centre for Policy Studies called Here to Stay?
Yes.
Could you comment on that? There's a headline figure which says that in their analysis, the fiscal cost of those who might be granted ILR in the next 4 or 5 years would amount to 234 billion.
Yes, I think that, as you suggested in your question, is a speculative number as much as your question is. Actually, it's extremely difficult to work out the fiscal impact of migration. We're doing it at the MAC at the moment. We can only do it because we have access to data that CPS couldn't possibly have. So, for example, I don't know how you do that kind of analysis without really very brave and, some may say, foolhardy estimates as to what these people are going to do when they're in the UK. So, for example, just to give you a very simple example, we currently don't know what dependents do when they come into the country. So we issue a skilled worker visa, let's say, dependent comes in, we know nothing about what they do, because the Home Office, quite fairly, doesn't pursue finding out about that dependent, they're legally here. But you need to know how much they earn and are they in jobs to work out what their contribution will be over the next 50 to 60 years of their lives. And I think it's very dangerous to just make broad assumptions about, they're going to be like this, they're going to earn this, and then you can come up with a very big number. It's no different than picking on a whole group of... I could choose a big group of British people who will also have very big negative effects, because if you just choose people who are low earners and perhaps people who are disabled, you automatically get those numbers because they're entitled to more benefits in the long run and they don't pay as much tax. I'm not sure what that tells us particularly.
I'm going to smooth in a very quick question, which is, in terms of the comparisons between the Australian offshore processing immigration approach and the Rwanda scheme, could you comment on the validity of the comparison? Are they actually comparable, and do you have anything to say about the efficacy of the Australian approach?
Well, as I understand it, the big difference is that in the Australian system, if your asylum application was granted, you were brought to Australia. That the system was that all it was offshore processing of the application. That's very different than the Rwanda scheme, where we were essentially washing our hands of any responsibility going forward for those asylum applicants. I think the Australian model is a model that I think is worth thinking about if you could find countries that would be willing to process the applications, because we are spending, let's be honest, an absolute fortune on housing asylum seekers here while we're considering their claims. And I think if you could find a cheaper and more effective way of doing that, while still recognising that we have the responsibility to take those asylum seekers who have claimed asylum in this country.
So it isn't entirely appropriate to compare the Australian offshoring approach and the Rwandan terror?
I wouldn't have thought so, no.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that evidence session. Are there any more questions? Seconds left. Order. That brings us to the end of the time allocated for the committee to ask questions. On behalf of the committee, I sincerely like to thank the witness for his evidence. Thank you very much. Now hear oral evidence from Dame Angela Eagle MP, Minister for Border Security and Asylum, and Seema Malhotra MP, Minister for Migration and Citizenship at the Home Office. We will have until 4:20 for this panel. I call the Shadow Minister.
Just looking at sort of changing approach, and particularly around the repeal of the Illegal Migration Act. in section 2, where we remove, by repealing this, we will remove the obligation on the government to remove people who arrive here illegally. What's the rationale behind that?
The Illegal Migration Act was flawed legislation which didn't actually work, and it was so flawed that the previous government, even though they put it onto the statute book, didn't actually commence very much of it at all.
In particular, the obligation to remove people who arrive here illegally. So whether it's in that legislation, whether it's in the legislation that you bring forward, why are we removing that as a principle?
Because the issue was that we didn't think that it was possible to make the suite of legislation which involved the Safety of Rwanda Act and the Illegal Migration Act together to work coherently. And the effect of it was essentially to allow people into the country, to make it illegal to process them and just leave them stuck in an ever-lengthening backlog in limbo. So the whole approach established by the interplay of those two acts of Parliament, one of which was barely commenced, most of which, even though it was on the statute book, wasn't commenced, had to be taken away so that we could bring some order to the chaos that we actually inherited from the previous government as a result of the practical outcomes of those two pieces of legislation.
I understand that, Colin, but we don't think as part of the approach that it should be an obligation on the government to remove people who come here legally.
No, certainly haven't said that. We will, as soon as people have had their asylum claims properly processed and the appeals that they are allowed to make to that finished, we will certainly seek, if they've failed, to remove them, but not to a third country.
And then further to that, the previous legislation, don't care about why it was removed, but the principle therein that if you arrived in this country illegally, you could not become a British citizen. That was there in legislation. It won't be when this has gone through. What is the rationale behind? Well, what message does it send to the world if people who arrive in this country, break into this country, can then go on to gain citizenship?
Well, the Home Secretary has made it perfectly clear in the changes to the advice on all of that we don't expect that if you come to this country illegally that you would be granted citizenship.
But we're taking that out.
We've taken that out of primary legislation because it was connected with the duty to remove, which was about the interplay of the Illegal Migration Act and the Safety of Rwanda Act, which, as I've just said, was flawed legislation which didn't work in practice.
And the Illegal Migration Act also made provisions in Section 57 and 58 allowing for scientific age verification. We're removing that as well. Why would we want to remove those powers from our agencies? We've seen the consequences in terms of safeguarding and the impact that could have on young people. Why would we not want to give all of the agencies all of the powers they could possibly have?
There are real issues about the accuracy of age assessment, scientific age assessment, and we are in the middle at the Home Office of doing work to try to see if we can get a system of scientific age assessment that is actually robust enough to use. So we're certainly not ruling it out, but again, the effects in that piece of legislation were all about the duty to remove. It was about trying to define children. You will remember that the duty to remove excluded children, which created in the IMA, which created a bigger incentive for people to claim perhaps that they were children when they weren't. And the scientific age assessment clauses in that act were actually related to the duty to remove. Given that we are repealing the vast majority of the Illegal Migration Act in this bill, we removed those clauses. But I wouldn't want to give the honourable gentleman the false impression that we have completely abandoned the idea of doing scientific age assessment. We are currently trying to assess whether there are ways of doing this which are cost effective but also which can be relied upon. It's not an easy thing to do. There are no very, very easy solutions to whether it's accurate or not. And it's those areas that we're exploring ahead of making any subsequent announcements about if and how, if we do, we will use scientific age assessment.
And then I'm sure we could spend all day arguing about the pros and cons of Rwanda, but very specifically, we see the effectiveness of returns agreements where they're in place. But then for those countries with whom we cannot return people, if these people are not going to Rwanda, where is the government going to go put these people that we cannot return to?
Well, firstly, we will always seek to return people if they've failed the asylum systems and had all of their claims and appeals as soon as it's safe to do so. So that's the first thing to say, and we must never lose sight of that. Situations in particular countries do change, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worst, as the Honourable Gentleman knows. And so we don't ever give up on that. And clearly, if people are here and they've failed, we want them to leave, and we will facilitate them to leave.
But where we don't have the ability to return, where we have countries where we can't return those people, they were going to go to Rwanda. Now where are they going?
Well, with all due respect, I don't think they were ever going to go to Rwanda. So,
Thank you. Mike Tapp.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Ministers. Since you've started your role, we've seen, I think it's 19,000 deported. I believe that's 24% increase on the same period last year. May I ask how you've managed to achieve that in such a short period of time? And combined with this bill, do you think that will start acting as a deterrent?
Well, I think one of the important things for the integrity of any asylum system is that if people fail it, there are consequences that are different than if they don't. And it's the hard and nastier end of any asylum system. If you have no right to be here, we will want you to leave voluntarily if at all possible, and sometimes we'll even facilitate that. We will return you by force if we have to. And the 19,000 returns that we've achieved since July the 4th are an indication that we want to ensure that enforcement of the rules is actually put into more effect than it was. There'd been very big falls in returns, very big falls in enforcement, and we want to put that right.
Thank you very much. Will Foster.
Thank you. Obviously, we've had a lot of mixed comments today in evidence session, but quite a few highlighted that this bill only tackles half the story of border security, asylum and immigration. It tackles the supply side, not the demand. Based on today, would you consider some potential amendments and a potential other strategy to attach to the bill to tackle the whole picture that we heard today that people want us as a country to tackle?
I mean, it's clearly important that we try to deal with the developments of organised immigration crime on our borders, and colleagues will have heard the comments from the NCA and from the Police Chiefs Council about how important it is to assert the rule of law in these areas. It's very, very important. And I think that is the main aim of this bill. If the Honourable Gentleman is talking about safe routes, I think that we heard some evidence today about safe routes. I'm personally sceptical that they would stop people wanting to come across in boats. If one takes the example of the Afghan schemes that we have, a safe route for particular people from Afghanistan who've been in danger by supporting UK forces, that is a legal route which is safe. But at the same time, last year, if we look, the highest nationality of small boat arrivals is Afghans. We have people arriving on small boats who come from countries where we have visa regimes. So I'm not convinced that we could provide enough places on safe routes to prevent people smugglers benefiting from that kind of demand. That is my opinion from having looked at what goes on. I accept the Honourable Gentleman might have a different one.
If I could just add to that. We also heard in the evidence about the scale of the challenge that we face, but how actually the small boats crossings is a sort of relatively new phenomenon in that we, had around 300 in 2018, and that's now 36,000, and that what this bill is doing in a very targeted way is looking at what more tools we can bring in, along with the Border Security Command, to tackle criminal gangs who literally are making, millions, if not more, out of people who are very, very vulnerable. And I think, for the, and seeing also that 2024 saw more deaths in the Channel than previous years shows that, it's becoming even more dangerous. So we've absolutely got to do everything we can to disrupt these criminal gangs. I do just want to therefore focus on that for this bill, because you won't be able to do everything in one piece of legislation. But it is important to say, and I just want to correct, I think, a bit of evidence that was given earlier from my understanding from Tony Smith that the UK resettlement scheme was closed. It is actually still open. And we have had over 3,000 refugees resettled via that scheme since its launch 4 years ago. And indeed, the number of refugees who are arriving on that does depend on a range of factors, and that includes recommendations from the UNHCR, as well as how much we're able to have offers of accommodation from local authorities, and that is an ongoing system. But this is legislation around tackling the small boats and really the criminal gangs that's enabling that as a new trade.
Thank you.
May I briefly follow up? Obviously, I appreciate the Minister's thoughts on safe routes. Obviously, Ukraine is long held up as a good example of it's meant we've housed a lot of people safely, and one person tried to cross the channel that was Ukrainian. But a brief follow-up on Clause 18, if I may, a bit more specific. We're creating a new criminal offence of endangering someone on a sea crossing. Why is it an unauthorised sea crossing? Why is it not a blanket endangering someone when crossing the sea? Isn't this offence, shouldn't this be wider, or is this more like an aggravating factor?
We'll get to talking about the very detailed aspect of this during our sessions on line-by-line scrutiny. But there's been certain behaviour which has begun to happen, which has been perceived on the crossings in the small boats, which this offence is designed to deal with, and that is various violent intimidation that goes on, putting women and children in the middle of boats that then collapse, where they're either crushed and die in that way, holding children over the edge of boats to prevent rescue. Sometimes, if there's been a fatality on a boat, we've seen what's happened. We go to pick people up and return them to France. The French authorities do that. There's a battle not to be returned, and violence is sometimes used to prevent people accepting the rescue that's offered them. So there are some very particular things that this endangerment clause and this new offence is seeking to deal with.
Thank you very much. Joe White.
Thank you, Ministers, for your evidence. So Tony Smith, in his evidence, retired 12 years ago. I was very critical of the role of the Border Commander and defined him as a coordinator. Do you believe that the Border Commander's powers need to be enhanced?
Well, the Border Commander is very happy with the powers that he has. He's been appointed, and again we'll talk about this in some detail, but it's really important that we can get coordination across different areas of activity, and I think you'll have heard what the NCA witness said about how he wants somebody else to do the coordination while he does the basic work. Everybody's working together very well across the people that have to have regard. The Border Security Commander is bringing together a range of very important players in this area to strategise and coordinate. And he hasn't told me, and I meet him regularly, that he needs any more powers.
Thank you. Pete Wishart.
Two quick points following compelling evidence we heard today. I think it's been a very, very good session. And the two things that come across powerfully to me is this view that this is going to do very little to actually tackle the gangs. And I think we heard that consistently throughout the evidence. They'll just adjust their business model. They've got a monopoly on their irregular migration trade. So they're obviously going to do what they can to maintain it. And the other thing is going to have very little impact upon people making the decision to come to the United Kingdom. They're fleeing oppression, poverty and war. And they don't care about the laws of the United Kingdom. What Angela Eagle's doing in a migration bill, that's not going to deter them from coming here. So what are we going to do to get on top of this? And should we be thinking, as we go through with this bill, look at fresh, new ideas to tackle this?
Well, we've just come out of a period of fresh new ideas and gimmicks and very expensive.
That's gone.
Very
I don't know
expensive.
Labour members lays up all day today. That's
very
gone.
expensive they turned out to be. We've inherited such a mess with huge backlogs, with very long waits for appeals that we've got to try to clear, with an asylum system that essentially broke down. I think one of our witnesses was talking about it being in meltdown earlier today. We're going to do the day job and start to get that system working. I think that fast, fair and effective immigration decisions is a very, very important part of all of this, as is removing those who fail, so that we can actually get to the stage where people know that if they come to this country and they don't have a reasonable chance of being accepted as an asylum seeker, they will be returned. I think that's what the deterrent is.
If I could just add one point, which is it's absolutely valid right to say that this is one part of trying to tackle the criminal gangs and also the demand, and certainly the other side of the work which the Home Secretary has been leading in terms of agreements with other countries for returns, and also what are the reasons why people are coming, what more could be put in place to be a deterrent, is work that, as I think was also talked about in evidence today about international diplomacy, also being an important part of the overall framework. And that is going on in parallel, and it is important to be working upstream through diplomacy and agreements with other countries too.
Thank you. Kenneth Stevenson.
Thank you, Chair. I was listening today and it was very, very interesting. You know, some of the words I'd written down about organised crime, about the border post, that he would be in charge. Maybe not he, it might be a she, and I'm not ultra woke. There would be 2 million people coming over from Gaza. The tagging system hadn't worked. There was no evidence of that. I didn't hear. I wanted numbers. As an engineer, I wanted to hear the background to that. Then I heard there was no magical solutions. War was not easy to win, so we're on a war with migrants. And then we spoke about unkindness to asylum seekers. I think that the most important things that I heard today were proactive, preemptive and disruptive. And I think that that's what this government is trying to do. And I wonder if you agree with me that it has to start with the gangs who are starting and pulling people across and pushing them across.
Yes, I think that there are many genuine asylum seekers, and many of who are granted when they're finally processed, who've come in that way. There are also people who are trafficked, who are in debt bondage, who go into sex work in nail bars, say from Vietnam, who end up, as the police chief told us, growing cannabis in hidden farms in all of our communities, being involved in serious crime, being sort of victims of modern slavery, some of them being the perpetrators of all of that kind of evil.
Order. That brings us to the end of the time allotted for the committee to ask questions. On behalf of the committee, I thank ministers for their evidence. That brings us to the end of today's session. The committee will meet again at 9:25 a.m. on Tuesday, the 4th of March, to begin line-by-line consideration of this bill. I invite the Government Whip to move the adjournment. The question is that further consideration of the bill be now adjourned. As many as are of that opinion, say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order. Sorry.
Portcullis House, the Boothroyd Room. 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 Portcullis